Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This is awesome. I am Emily Royal. I am a Smart City Coordinator at the Office of Innovation at the City of San Antonio. And this is a really great moment for me, as my colleagues can attest to. I have been talking their ear off over the last 2 weeks. If you've been anywhere near our office in the last few weeks at all, about the opportunity to share this stage with Bianca Wylie, who's coming to us from Toronto, Canada. Bianca is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And among many things that she has done, she is perfectly poised to lead this discussion about the right to the smart city, and in particular is a global voice in shaping that conversation internationally. So it's my great pleasure to welcome her into this space. And Bianca, why don't we start a little bit by talking about some of your experience and background working on smart cities and working on this conversation about public rights in the smart city.
Certainly. It's great to be here. It sounds like you're poised to do something great with San Antonio, so I'm really excited to talk a bit about that. I have a background in technology, but I also have a background in running public meetings, public engagement. And in the last year and a half, I've been really, as a resident in Toronto, engaged in advocacy around a smart city project, Sidewalk Labs, which is an affiliate of Google. There's been a project going on in Toronto, so I've been heavily involved in that. And those pieces of my background, I think, bring a few things together. One thing I heard a lot already is how hard and messy the conversations are about people's rights within a smart city. And I have to say that is the truth. A lot of what is already sort of the status quo in cities, the way that data is collected or the way that technologies are used, I would argue that there is not adequate social license for that already. A lot of people are giving up data, and a lot of tools are using people's data that I can tell you they do not know is happening. And so I just want to flag that before we go forward into what the future of smart cities looks like, we actually need to check in on the status quo of what smart cities are. And so I think that's been a really important learning. And I think what's happened in the last year, with a bit of the techlash starting, is people are waking up and realizing, like, when I got a cell phone, I thought I was just getting a phone that came around with me. I didn't realize I had a sensor. It wasn't sold to anybody as a sensor, right? And this may sound really like, well, obviously, but like not really. Not really. So I think that's one really critical thing is, that we have to get people to a point where there's clarity on what's happening now before we can even talk about what we want to do next. I think the second thing I'll just say from a background that I have in public engagement, how many people here go to the public meetings, town halls, whatever you call them? Like lots of people, not so many, don't know? Okay, so the thing that I've learned in my time doing public engagement is that consensus is a bit of a myth. If we have a meeting in a room like this, and everybody walks out, and everybody walks out kind of saying, oh, okay, I guess I can live with that, that's actually a good outcome. That may not sound like a good outcome, but I think that's what it means to get to something that works for everyone, is that when you hear something difficult, you say, okay, under what conditions is that okay with me? And so you start to get into negotiation so that nobody thinks we're going to get to some utopian vision of a smart city where everybody thinks, like, perfect. We have to bring in all the different stakeholders. So it is very much a multi-stakeholder kind of conversation that requires intense facilitation. Like, this is not the kind of discussions where you just drop people into a room and then people can talk for a few hours and leave. You're going to need to get at what's hard and messy and difficult. So I think those are two things to start that I can share.
Cool.
Yeah.
So when it comes to data in the smart city, we know that there are so many stakeholders. As data flows through the smart city, it touches a variety of different stakeholders, whether that's a utility or a city government or a person who's receiving a public service. So how do we align the needs of all of these stakeholders when it comes to data in the smart city?
Right.
So, and you may not know, and that's fine. Because that's
a great point.
Really
I don't know should be a thing you hear a lot right now. I wish I heard more people saying they didn't know, so thank you for reminding me. I don't know exactly, but I have some ideas around it. One thing that I love about smart cities is it finally takes discussions about data and makes them tangible and concrete. It brings it into places and physical spaces that people can understand. Oh, I did that thing. There's a data trail. I get it. I went to the library. You saw my path. Or I used energy, and I understand that consumption data. Whereas to date, all the data discussions generally were about someone at a computer, and it just went off into the abstract. I ran a place called the Open Data Institute of Toronto, and I'm telling you, at cocktail parties, like when I would be like, hey, let's talk about data, it's like people are like, get me away from her. Like someone save me, right? So I don't
totally relate.
Yeah, I don't lead with data in a social context anymore. But when you talk to people about libraries or energy or green space or parks, then they're like, yeah, I get that. So you can start to make them more inclusive by talking about a physical space. But I think I like to share this phrase that a colleague of mine, Teresa Scassa, came up with to talk about data and consent, because what she said right now is that right now people don't consent to things. They don't consent to data, they surrender. And I think it's such a great way to summarize the problem with the open-ended licensing of the way data is really just sort of, someone signs an agreement and then you kind of lose track of what happens. And I think what we have the opportunity to do now with data is to start to talk in very granular, specific cases about data, how it could be used, what you are okay with, what you are not okay with, and start to negotiate in very specific ways in a city. So I think that's it's a really interesting opportunity because a lot of the time people are talking about data ownership, but what we kind of need to do right now is switch to data usage. It's the usage that people are concerned about. Like an example, when I've talked to people about their data being used to cure a rare disease, and if I say, say you got a prompt when you were sharing your data and you said, well, this could be used to help research a disease, most people would say yes. And if the next prompt would say, that solution may be commercialized, or your data may then be used by a company to make money, and then people might pause and say, well, hang on, well, maybe no, or maybe I want to share in that, or maybe something else. But the commercialization of data seems to be a tripwire. So it's just one of those things I would flag as a thing to think, when we're talking about cities, what is data for the public good? What is something that there's a collective agreement that should be out and used by a lot of people? And what is the line with individual data, and how does it go from individual to collective? I've got a good energy story about that, but I'm gonna stop. But those are, I think, like bringing us into usage discussions in cities is gonna help us get to the next level of getting consent and getting people to agree, oh, you're doing this with my data and I know what you're doing and I agree with you? Perfect. Let's do more of that. Like that's the opportunity right now, and we can do that. But we need to talk about actual tangible use cases.
Have you seen any strategies that have worked in other cities that you've studied or worked in about how to identify what those use cases are authentically?
Yeah, so one story that I love to tell is, anybody hear about Ecobee? It's like a Nest kind of product? Yeah, okay. So I've read a great story about Ecobee customers agreeing to share data with both, obviously with utility who has, but just more generally to say, I'm okay with the consumption of my energy use being shared. And then that data being used to make a case against creating a new power generation space because it wasn't needed. And that was such a fantastic story for me because it's not just data for commercialization. In some cases, you use data to make a case for a decision around policy that makes people kind of happy to participate in sharing because they got to an end decision that made sense in that case. That will not be every story. But the reason that's really interesting and important to tell is because I work with a lot of privacy advocates, and one thing that is scary right now is that if everybody gets too freaked out about sharing their data, we're gonna miss the chance to use it proactively and beneficially. And we got to watch that right now because I get into this all the time with privacy advocates. And I have sort of been called a privacy advocate, and I'm like, well, not really, but I guess that's the word we're using for this, okay? But it's something to really, really watch. Because if fear drives these discussions and we are very close to that being the defining narrative, we're going to lose out on those opportunities, to use it in a good public policy way. So we need to, hold on to that and fix it right now.
I'm thinking about Texas versus Canada politically as you're speaking.
Yeah, great. I can imagine. Well, related to, and I think this is where industry has a really important role to play. How many people here have heard of GDPR, which is a General Data Protection Regulation? Yeah. So this is the EU sort of thinking it was getting ahead on doing better legislation and regulatory action around data. And I thought for a while it was the gold standard, it was great. And then I started to talk to people from Europe who told me that industry is actually not in a good place with this legislation because it's unclear. So it's one of these regulatory moves that sounds good, but if industry is sitting around and worrying if they're going to make a mistake about what they do and then will they get in trouble for it, that's not good legislation. And so this is one of these places where when I've talked to business leaders in Canada, I said, governments are so scared of getting in your way that they're getting to be trouble to you because they're not helping protect you. So this is where I feel some empathy for the business community right now, because they're not getting the sort of legislative support that they need that's well informed. It's either going to be like scary legislation or too hands off until we have a problem. So I think, again, it's why convening this broad range of stakeholders is critical. Because the things that people tell me, like the business people I work with, they say, can you just help me know what to do? Because I don't want to do anything wrong. I'm not interested in having a human rights problem. That's not my intention. But I need clear rules on how to act. But I can't spend my every day going to a task force on digital rights. Like, that's not how I can run my business. So we're in this interesting place, I think, where sort of letting it be too much of a free-for-all ends up hurting everybody, and again, ends up being problematic to taking what's the opportunity here.
So it sounds like you're describing a Bill of Rights almost in the smart city. How could you maybe imagine what the tenets of that Bill of Rights would look like?
Yeah. I think one of the principles that is part of the GDPR is data minimization, which makes sense. I think what happens with a lot of the smart city conversations that shouldn't happen when you're having a new one is the default be, well, we're collecting all kinds of data. Now let's mitigate the potential harms. Like, that's not the way it should be. It should be the other way around, right? It's like, what's the minimal amount of data we need to do the good thing? And that's where we start. Because, I don't know, I was around for the 90s for the internet bubble. Anybody here remember that? Like, that sort of, yeah. Also another term, like the irrational exuberance of the markets. I feel like we're in a bit of that right now with data, because from an economics perspective, we're in a period of slow growth. And I feel like right now everybody's gone on this narrative, data's the new oil, data's the future, data's the economy, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, which is, yes, some of that is right.
Lots of energy analogies of data. Data's the new exhaust.
Totally. Data's the new, data's the new, there's so many. But the problem with that narrative is that we don't talk enough about data as a toxic asset, data as a liability. Like, this is, in the governance circles that I'm in, the language that people, I'm hearing that more from people who look around data governance and they think, and I've sat with cities for years. Cities have not been super jazzed to hold on to tons of data. It's expensive. You're jacking up liability, and same in industry. So there's really no reason to do this hoarding that I think that sort of market narrative is encouraging. It's better to think more precisely about what should be collected and why. And also, one thing people seem to forget, you can get rid of data. This is the data life cycle. Like, you can collect it, you can use it, and you can delete it. Like, you don't need to have it around forever. Is that thing going like, oh, do we still have that? Which you usually know because you pay to keep it. But what's the minimal amount, and how long do you need it for? Time scale is a really important feature that we don't talk enough about. How long do you need to have data for? How long? And governments grapple with this because we're getting into this interesting place where archival records become critical documents, as we know, in government. And now we're getting into this place where it's like, well, at what point in time do you stop with continuous data and take a picture and store it, and that becomes a record, right? So there's some interesting features of data that I think make those things challenging. But I think back to the Digital Bill of Rights stuff, a lot of it is just expanding what the currently existing human rights frameworks are into digital spaces. It's not that we necessarily have to invent all kinds of new stuff, because those existing frameworks are pretty solid, and they're global. So I think that's the place to look to start.
I'm thinking about, as we deliver public services in the smart city, we have an opportunity to interface with our customers or our residents. And that typically takes the form of some kind of online or digital platform where you check a box that says, I consent to the privacy terms and agreement that you maybe didn't read. And if you did click on it and did read it, it would be a 30-page long document that you're just going to scroll until you get to the end. So how can we reimagine what that interface looks like with our public when we are trying to communicate with them about what we're doing with their data and how we may want to create trust and consent in that space?
Yeah. So I think, again, the physicality of cities lend themselves to this problem. So sandbox. Does anybody have any sandboxes around, like any sort of technical sandbox? I think sandboxes are this really cool opportunity for cities, because what you can do, and cities have space, they have physical land that they could generally go and set up a space, set up sensors, right? You can start to teach and say, and this also brings us into like IIoT, the industrial Internet of Things kind of data versus the Facebook kind of data, right? Like these are totally different worlds. And a lot of the IIoT data, that's the safe space. Stephen, when you talked about urgency in the, acting on, to work on policy stuff with urgency, a lot of the policy issues that are urgent, climate change, primarily, have to do with data that's not personal, which is perfect, because you can start to lay things out that show people how things work with sensors. Stick a sensor on a pipe and show how it catches water leakage. Show to people that that's what this technology can do. Right? And you can collect air quality data and in a test site, show people what you can do with it. This is amazing for a few reasons. It gets us into looking at the beautiful opportunity in technology, so we get off of the negative, scary world. We do that. We show people what sensors are and how they work, and people can build these things. This can be a tech development opportunity too. You can swing by the library, build out a sensor, stick it on a pipe. You can watch the whole thing happen. And the last opportunity there is that you're getting out of, and back to urgency, where things are scary and shouldn't go fast right now has to do with human behavioral data. That's where you do not want to be making policy quickly. Things to do, this is the surveillance capitalism narrative, this is the behavioral data, this is where we're getting into some weird places where people know more about you than you do. This is not the place to go fast. These are hard conversations about morals and ethics and philosophy and what are we doing. Let's hive that off. All of the things I just talked about with the IoT, environmental data, administrative data, geospatial data, we have wonderful opportunity with that tech to act fast. Let's be urgent in how to use that tech to apply to pressing policy issues. This other stuff around human behavioral data, let's ring fence that sucker and put it to the side. And let's not go fast on that, because going fast on that is how we got to where we are today, which is not anything to do anymore, right? So I think this is for real the great opportunity. It's all right there. And then all of those kind of sandboxing things, you bring in local community, you bring in small, medium-sized business, you bring in large business. There's room for everybody. But I think the final thing about all of this is that what I see in cities, and I don't know if this is the same here, but oftentimes I have to do air quotes, progressives think about, whether it's rights or justice or anything else, sometimes it just automatically gets into an anti-business narrative. And this is so troubling, because without a strong business community, you can't fund your own infrastructure. You can't fund the things that you need for public service delivery. So when I think this is an opportunity to convene great conversations, I mean it across the board. Because it helps people to see, everybody has to play here, right? And so then I think we're starting to evolve even an understanding of what progressive means and how we get from here to there, and to sort of understand everybody's involved, right? And so I think great opportunities with all of that. But that real sandbox, bring everybody in, do a tangible thing, practical, watch it start to finish. Bring in your libraries. Libraries are fantastic partners in doing this kind of work. Neutral, as not perfectly neutral, but decently neutral, have their heads around data, have their heads around governance of shared assets. They can be great partners.
That's great. So I want to talk a little bit about trust.
Yeah.
Building trust in the smart city, or maybe just in cities in general. What are some of your experiences or maybe examples of successful trust building between all of these stakeholders that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think the one thing I loved that the story that was shared about, we're resetting our smart city policy in Australia, I think it was. The one big learning is that, and I don't know, again, this is fascinating because all politics are local, right? I may say this and you may tell me this is wrong for San Antonio, but what I know in Toronto is the discussion about these policies has to happen between people and their government. It cannot be a discussion that is convened by a vendor. It can't. It does not land. And this line between the market and the state is getting so blurry, and you have tech companies. I mean, my experience in Toronto is I sat in a town hall, you had a tech company CEO and a public agency CEO, and if you closed your eyes and listened to the tech company CEO, you would swear you would think he was an elected official. Affordable housing, resilient cities, like saying all the words, and I'm thinking, those aren't your words, my friend. Like those, you can use them, but they're not why you're doing this. Like, what's your business model? And so the rhetoric around smart cities has been totally captured by the technology industry. And the problem with that is twofold. First of all, it's blurring the line between market and state, which is not helpful when you're having these conversations. But the second thing is that people shut down because Silicon Valley has done this thing, and this is intentional, that it's really complicated. Like, you wouldn't really understand what we're doing here, but it's beautiful. It is the future. Come along with us. Why wouldn't you? And it puts politicians in this nasty bind because no politician wants to be anti-innovation. No politician wants to be seen as a Luddite. No human being wants to be seen as stupid. And unfortunately, tech companies, their MO is to basically be like, you don't need to understand, just trust me. And there's a reason why the big tech companies are branded very differently than Wall Street, but they're lobbying more than Wall Street now. That's not by accident. The branding around tech is friendly and fun and whatever else it may be, but that conveys that, like, well, it's all good. The future is here, come along with us. And what that has done to people and done to us as a society, it has removed the human agency from the equation. People build tech. People can make tech that is not even capitalist in nature. You can just make tech the same way. I go back to civil engineering. You can make tech to build things that we need in the public sector, full stop. That's an option. It doesn't have to be a business. Like, we need both. But this is important. And when I saw this Dear Tech ad, anybody see this? I'm still reeling from it. I'm like, you talk about on the Twitters. Go on the Twitters and find this. It's called Dear Tech, and it is from IBM. Are they up on this screen as a sponsor? Because I do this to myself. Every time I speak, I do this to myself.
I think you're okay for right now.
Okay. But even if they were, we could have this conversation. We have to be able to have hard conversations. But it's very much, Dear Tech, let's have good AI. Dear Tech, let's be this. And it's like, Dear Tech, Dear Tech. It's like, I'm tech, you're tech, we're all tech, we make tech. Like, it's got a human agency element, and we need to reclaim that. And that human agency needs to inform city policy, and that human agency needs to be visible in the conversations around smart cities. So this is why, to me, the convening has to be between government and residents. And then, once they've set the requirements and set the ground rules, procure all day long. You know, like, go for it. It's not to say that there is not a huge opportunity for the involvement of many stakeholders, as we talked about. But when you're setting the rules around how your society functions or how your city works, that's policy. That's government, right? Not and like that, there's just a clarity there. So they can be at the table, but not as a lead convener. Like, I think that's an important lesson.
So moving forward, San Antonio is in this space where we're kind of entering the smart city environment. And we're right now just really on the cusp of developing how we're going to position ourselves in this emerging space. What are some lessons that you might share for San Antonio?
Well, based on what I heard this morning, you're already on the right track. Like, you're not repeating the last 10 years of smart city nonsense, which has been like somebody standing up and saying, well, we'll do all these things, then here, just pay me. That's kind of what it was for 10 years. I mean, no, I'm not, like, I know that sounds over, that's not that far from being accurate. It's not exactly right, but this idea that there has to be real engagement in it. And I think what is good in San Antonio may be different than what is good in Toronto. And this is why privacy has been such a mess, is because you go globally, what privacy means to people in different cultures, totally not the same thing. And city to city, totally not the same thing. And I feel like the relationship maybe in Texas with government may be different and then a different state. You know, like I don't know. But I think that's why you have to leave this flexibility. And right now, like Barcelona is a city that's sort of the cool kid of the smart city scene. And they're using a word often which is called technological sovereignty, a phrase. And what that idea, what's sort of inherent to that idea is that residents and government need to have ownership, and not necessarily ownership in terms of ownership, like own the asset, but must be at the center of not just data, but digital infrastructure. Like those things need to be something that everybody within a city and government definitely is very close to, having access to. You can't start to repeat the last 20 years. I mean, government technology procurement, not a good scene from what's happened in the last 20 years. A lot of governments have made a decision and then kept repeat awarding a vendor because they're the ones who know the mess they're making the best. Like, it's not a good business model. From what I've seen and where I live, like it's really uncomfortable that's how it goes down. So I think here, maintaining that idea of technological sovereignty is a nice one to look at what Barcelona's done. But Barcelona, you know, no politics can be transplanted around either. Barcelona, you know, has a mayor who came, you know, who was a housing activist. And so a lot of the people in Barcelona also, I don't know how it is here, in Toronto, people who own homes, they're who are politically active at the city level. Renters, not so much. So I don't know what's happening here, but you have to go right back to the roots and look at how are your urban planning policies? Like in Toronto, they're anti-Black. They're racist. They're not a thing that you then just build more engagement on top of, as an example, right? So you have to go back into the roots of how you're already governing spaces and say, okay, hold on, is this, like, it's not to say that now you just power up on tech, you know, on top of urban planning, because that is already its own problem. And I think we need to really realize that there's a lot of similarity between urban planning and technology. They're highly technocratic, they're top down, they're difficult to engage on, they're inaccessible. But what I can say about technology is that what it does to power is it entrenches it. Whatever sort of setups you have now, if you're gonna now enable more people in different places to have some power, it will entrench whatever divisions you have right now. So I think that's why you have to be so careful when you go forward. And that's why it's great to hear that awareness this morning, this openness. So this is, again, why I was saying about business development and people understanding the role of industry. And they're critical players in the discussion, that we can kind of convene almost like, there's a chance to really have a new politics around this, right? Like, which I think is super exciting. But you have to look at it big. You have to look at it large, messy, right? Like, that has to be okay. And I think where I am concerned for government is not given the permission to make mistakes enough as they're gonna have to be good right now. So this is what I do as a resident, is I advocate all the time. I'm like, if the city says a thing and it changes its mind, great, let that happen. Because the city can't be so worried that, you know, that it can't act, and then it waits, then it acts, and then it digs in and defends because they can't change their mind. So that's a cultural challenge in this discussion that I think if cities can't say it about themselves, residents, it's really incumbent upon residents to come out and to say that and to like stick up for the city. Because I used to be a big advocate for open data, and part of my role after I realized it wasn't working so well in all cases was I would go out in public and I'd be like, no, they don't have to open all their data because they're the government and they do things differently than the private sector and they do things differently than residents. And they need to have some trust for what they're doing with their information. Like, this isn't a free-for-all on transparency, because that gets kind of messy too. And that's, again, progressive. Some people think, well, I'm a taxpayer, I paid for it, I should have access to everything. And it's like, no, that doesn't fly either. So those are all, I think, bits and pieces that all I feel like I'm doing is confirming everything I heard before I sat down. So I feel like you're already on a good, but I really feel like you're already on a good track, and I don't think 1.5 million is mid-size, but cities that aren't massive are also way better positioned. All the research says the best cities and innovation are mid-size. You don't have to work through 17 lawyers in the procurement thing. You know, you don't have to wait
Only
for,
5.
Yeah, 20, you're right, 25. Toronto, once I started to go to other cities in Canada that were smaller, I was like, oh great, I'm in the place, everything will happen last. But I'm gonna stay there, but yeah. But I think it's okay. I'm honestly saying it sounds like you've got everything going. That's right. I would just really see what's going on in the world, but don't copy another city because it said it's progressive. Like you got to go on what's progressive from here, from what's this real like local politics rule is real, right? So make space, make time, urgent where it's safe, slow where it's hard, right? You got to pull back on some of the status quo, but go fast on the stuff that's safe. And then, you got every kind of opportunity in the world. And let's work together. From Toronto, like I want to keep talking to people. So however we can triangulate discussions, well, I guess it's only 2. We'll find something else to triangulate. But, however we can keep these, we have 26 seconds for me to 27, 28, it's going up. Are we over time?
I think now it's going up, yeah.
Okay, that's not good. I just want to say cities, I think cities are the future for dealing with the gnarliest problems in the world. So we should all be working together more on this, and this is a great opportunity for it. So thank you so much for having me, and this is great.